this is not the end. A BatFam fanfic written by Erynestel and read by Yo Stories. Summary. Sense? This doesn't make any sense, Jason repeated, angry. Gotham has no idea how humans really work and decided on a whim to throw us all together because she didn't want to lose her toy. We were all just conveniently there and fit into her schemes, so she revived us. Well, he took a deep breath. I, for one, have no intention of being part of Batman's emotional support family because the man didn't manage to take care of himself properly. He glared at Wayne, who winced slightly but didn't say anything. Or, after Batman dies due to an injury he receives on patrol, Gotham is devastated. So she decides to use some of her power to revive him, not wanting to lose him a second time. She also analyzes what went wrong and comes to the conclusion that her bat was lacking the support network most humans have, a so-called family. Luckily, this is solved easily. She'll just revive some other in her domain as well, a caretaker and several young humans called children. They can be her bat family, and her bat can happily continue to fight the rot that had spread through her borders. Perfect! Or Jason would really like to know what his life is. This author's notes. Hello and welcome to my new fic, my first one in this fandom. To be honest, my knowledge of canon mostly comes from reading fanfiction and playing Gotham Knights. But this is an AU, so I hope I didn't mess up anything too badly. If I did, though, feel free to tell me. Please note that English is not my first language. Reader's note, neither is mine. Continuation of the author's notes. So if you spot any grammar or spelling mistakes, you can tell me. No insults, though. I only accept nice, constructive criticism. Content warning for this chapter. Major character death mentioned slash described. Major character undeath. Panic attack. Implied reference to child abuse and neglect. Swearing implied slash referenced racism. Please let me know if I forgot anything. Enjoy. I'll put that list of content warnings in the description. There's also a second chapter, and I'll also put those content warnings down there. Although they are, I think they are all the same. Chapter 1. Jason comes to beside an open grave, covered in mud. The world around him dark except for the faint light of a waxing moon that was partly covered by clouds. It was silent around him, almost eerily so, and cold. There were no other people, only the silhouettes of gravestones and trees and bushes. Puddles shimmered on a slightly overgrown path that sneaked around the grounds. Their surfaces rippled in the cold breeze that had Jason surprisingly not shivering. He felt cold, but he didn't even have goosebumps. He he didn't know how he'd gotten here. What what had happened? Why was he here? Where was he? He looked down at his hands, streaked in dirt and full of wooden splinters that weirdly didn't hurt. His nails chipped and broken, some even missing. And why did he look like he just crawled out of a... Oh God. Jason's breathing picked up and his legs suddenly refused to hold his weight as his gaze strayed to an open grave again. Though calling it open was maybe a bit too generous. It had a hole in it, sure, but otherwise it didn't seem new. It looked more like someone had decided to dig into the earth with his hands. He fell onto his knees harshly, mud squelching as it dawned on him, staring in horror. Jason hadn't even noticed he'd been standing up in the first place. No, that wasn't possible. What? He croaked out, his voice cracking midway and sending him into a coughing fit. His throat was dry and it felt like he hadn't spoken in a while, which added up if. But no, that was impossible. What the fuck? He whispered into the silence, still staring at the partially collapsed hole in the middle of the grave. It almost looked like someone had dug his way out, like the person in the grave had woken up and decided to take a walk, and Jason was covered in mud. His hands were hurt like he'd scratched and banged against something wooden, like he tried to break a board with his bare fingers and even succeeded. Like he'd woken up in a coffin and fought to escape it with all his strength. A cold feeling settled in his chest as he stared and stared, unmoving. His hands trembled. Actually, his whole body started shivering. He was probably in shock. Had had he been the one to come out of the grave? Jason slowly lifted his eyes and tried to read the words on the small headstone that was on the other side of the hall. It was simple, roughly hewn thing with moss growing in several patches, like no one had been taking care of it for a while. The moon provided enough light to barely make out the letters. John Doe died 2022. That was all it said. No, in loving memory of, or in rest in peace. There were no flowers on the grave either. It looked overgrown and uncared for, and also at least several years old, which couldn't be right because the gravestone said 2022, and that was the current year, right? Right? Jason desperately tried to remember where he'd last been, what had happened before this, but everything was blurry in his memory. It it had been January 2022, and he'd been squatting in an abandoned building across from the old movie theater. Yes, that sounds right. He'd even managed to scrounge up a dirty blanket from somewhere to keep him warm, but it had been cold. So cold. Jason instinctively shivered more at the memory. It had snowed outside, but at least the walls and boarded up window had sheltered him from the worst of the wind, and then his breath hitched. Then, some random evening, four other teenagers had discovered his house. They'd been a few years older than him, probably around 17, and thrown him out after soundly beating him up. Fuck. Fuck, Jason remembered now. Everything had hurt, and he'd been so cold and had stumbled around outside, desperately searching for some other shelter. The snow had quickly soaked through his worn out jacket and hoodie. They'd taken his blanket as well, and the wind had robbed him of any warmth he'd still had. It had already been dark. Jason's hands fisted the fabric of his jeans, knuckled white. He trembled harder, couldn't control it. He'd been so cold and afraid he'd actually considered going to one of the homeless shelters, even though he'd known that he'd almost certainly be snatched up and trafficked if he went there. But he hadn't even made it. Gotham's winters were harsh, and it had been an especially cold night. From how it felt, Jason would have guessed the temperature to be around 5 degrees. The next shelter had been 7 blocks away. He'd slipped on a patch of ice underneath the snow halfway there, in some random alley. He had landed hard on his side, his head whacking against the cold ground with a sickening crack. He'd barely felt it, had barely felt any of his injuries anymore at that point. Everything was cold and numb. And, and Jason hadn't been able to get up again. His limbs just hadn't moved the way he wanted them to, and the snow had continued to fall on him, these thick snowflakes that seeped away any remaining strength he'd had. Oh god. Jason dry heaved, the sick feeling in his stomach suddenly intensified thousandfold. He made a sound that was a mixture between a groan and sob and a aborted scream. He died in that alley, Handy, frozen to death. Try as he might, Jason couldn't remember anything after that alley. He'd laid there, numb and limbs heavy and unnaturally tired, and then he'd woken up here, in this cemetery, next to a grave someone had apparently just crawled out of, streaked in dirt, with broken fingernails, alone. He couldn't deny it any longer. He'd died. Jason's thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion and desperation. He hysterically wondered how long it had taken them to find his body in that alley. The snow had probably obscured him and stalled any smell. No one had been looking for him, and the streets had almost been empty in the bad weather. So there'd probably been no witnesses of his fall. Depending on how long it had been until it thawed again, he might have laid there for days until some poor soul stumbled about him. Jason heaved again, bending over and supporting himself on trembling arms. Nothing came out of his mouth. John Doe. They'd never identified him. Of course not. There was no one left who knew him. His parents were dead, and he hadn't had any documents with his name on them. Jason's fingerprints weren't in the system, as after his mum had overdosed, he'd run away before he could be taken into foster care. They probably hadn't bothered to look any further, considering he'd just been one of the many dead homeless people in Gotham. Just tossed him into a cheap grave and called it a job well done. Oh god. Maybe you should be grateful they'd most certainly opted for the least expensive coffin on the market, Jason thought numbly as he looked at the wooden splinters in his hands again. Plywood was probably easier than to break through than solid oak or some shit. Break through. Because Jason had somehow come to life again? It didn't make any sense. Nothing made sense. And then, suddenly, a wave of calm swept over Jason out of nowhere. He blinked, the fear and confusion gone from one moment to the next. His mind was blissfully silent. Slowly, he righted himself up, climbed to his feet again, his head turned into a certain direction almost of his own. The rest of his body followed. Nothing was important anymore as he started to set one foot in front of the other. One foot in front of the other, walking into the direction of the cemetery's eastern gates. Nothing but the absolute certainty that he had to go to Wayne Manor and that this was the right way. When Jason came to a second time, he was sitting on a couch in what seemed to be a posh living room, still covered in mud. He blinked as the artificial calm that had wrapped around his mind slowly trickled away, leaving him aware and in charge of his own actions again. Dumbfounded, he took in the expensive looking furniture around him. everything illuminated by a fucking chandelier that hung from the ceiling. Its light was reflected by large windows, which were framed by heavy velvet curtains. It was still dark outside. There was also a huge fireplace, though not lit currently. The most alarming thing, however, were the three other people that sat across from Jason on a similar couch. The one thing between them, a low wooden table that was covered in haphazardly strewn around documents and notes. What the hell? What? A confused voice said to his right, and Jason flinched, turning around and hastily getting up and backing away from the unknown person right next to him. Unfortunately, there seemed to be another person he hadn't registered until now, who'd apparently been sitting on his left side, as he stumbled over two legs that shouldn't have been there and fell backwards, flailing. He shouted in surprise and braced himself for a painful impact when suddenly two strong hands caught him by the shoulders and steadied him. Careful, someone said in a calm voice and turned him around before Jason could react. Are you alright? He found himself face to face with an older man, in what looked to once have been a nice suit with coattails, but was now torn and dirty. He had grey hair and sported an impressive moustache. His forehead set in a frown as he studied Jason. Jason stared back, frozen, before ripping himself out of the man's grip and backing away once more, away from the sitting area so he had every of the strangers in his sight. The older man let him go without a fuss, his gaze flitting over the other people in the room as well. Jason belatedly realized his face was streaked with mud, similar to what his own face must have looked like. Actually, now that he took note of it, every person here, except one, looked like they had crawled out of a grave prior to this, their clothing ripped and muddy. What the fuck was he? Why had he walked here? Who the fuck were these people? What the fuck was going on? Jason had spun and he started to feel faint. This? What is this? The person who'd spoken first continued, sounding on edge. It was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, with black hair, blue eyes, and a tan skin. He was wearing a simple t shirt and flat jeans and looked beyond freaked out. Jason could relate. Who are you? Jason's head swiveled around once more. He'd get whiplash at this point, to look at the man who'd spoken this time. It was the guy who wasn't covered in mud, which made him the outlier here, and he had an intense and threatening look on his face. He jumped up from where he'd been sitting on the other couch, his body in what seemed to be a fighting stance. His blue eyes studied all of them with mistrust, sweaty black hair plastered onto his forehead. He looked weirdly familiar. Jason also noted two other things that had him suck in yet another shock breath. One, the guy's hands were very bloody, like he'd just murdered someone, and two, he was wearing a black outfit with a bat symbol on his chest, which Jason recognized. Sure, the cowl was missing, but this? It seemed one of the little kids next to him, and yeah, there were two kids as well. What the fuck? Had clocked in on the same thing Jason had, as at that moment he said in Al's voice, Batman? The man in the Batman suit flinched and opened his mouth, presumably to deny the question and demand answers once more, but the grey haired man interrupted. Everyone calm down. He said in a loud voice that sounded used to giving orders and having them obeyed. Jason noticed he had a British accent. The other man, Batman? What even was Jason's life? Looked at Moustache with a startled expression, mouth falling shut with an audible click. The kid followed his example, staying silent and looking at the oldest, as did the teenager who'd spoken first. The man clasped his hands in front of his muddy suit. The posh gesture was so at odds with the sorry state of his appearance that Jason had the hysterical urge to laugh. He swallowed it down. "Thank you," the old man said in slightly quieter but still authoritative tone. Then he looked at them all with a serious expression. "Now, we seem to have quite the situation on our hands. It seems we're all very confused and looking for answers, me included. So I suggest we sit down, take a breath, and try to make sense of all this in an orderly manner." He pointedly sat down on the couch again, looking at them expectantly. Jason found himself nodding almost automatically, following the suggestion and sitting down on the floor right where he stood. He was closest to the door this way and could flee quickly should it become necessary. It sounded like a good idea. He fucking needed answers right now, and if this man helped him get them, great. The other occupants of the room also complied, though possibly Batman narrowed his eyes and only sat down reluctantly after a second. There was a moment of tense silence as they all studied each other. There were 6 people, Jason noticed, though only 2 seemed to be adults. On the one couch, the one Jason woke up on, was Mustache, who was maybe in his late 60s, and next to him, the teenager. On the other couch, across from them, sat possibly Batman and the 2 kids. The child in the middle, who'd spoken earlier, had blue eyes and black hair as well, which weirded Jason out because he also had black hair and blue eyes, and that seemed to be a pattern, and looked to be around 11 years old. His clothes consisted of a long sleeved shirt and jeans. The last person, who was an even younger child, Jason guessed about 7 years old, with darker skins, similar to the teenagers, and green eyes. As far as Jason could tell, he'd remained frozen the entire time, observing them all with a blank face that seemed somehow wrong on such a young face. And his clothes. Jason did a double take. Yep, the boy was wearing a grey vest over a formerly white shirt and similar dark grey pants, along with black shoes. Around his neck was a brown tie. He looked like he'd came out of a 19th century novel Jason liked to read before he became homeless and didn't have the chance anymore. Nothing made any fucking sense. Moustache finally cleared his throat and spoke up. "Again, thank you. I believe it is in all of our interests to clear things up as fast and calmly as possible. We should start by establishing who we are and what we currently know about this situation. Does anyone have objections to that?" Jason remained silent, same as the other miners present. He didn't trust anyone here as far as he could throw them, least of all the adults. But he was secretly glad the man had decided to take charge. He felt lost and confused and scared and just didn't want this nightmare to end. Possibly Batman made a face and glared at Moustache with a distrust, but ground out, "Fine." "Excellently," Moustache replied, and sat up even straighter. "I shall start then. My name's Alfred Pennyworth, and I am the butler of the Wayne family." The other man hissed, "Liar!" he said accusingly, standing up again and looming over Moustache threateningly. "I think I would remember having a butler, and I certainly don't remember you. What is this? Are you responsible for all this?" Pennyworth lifted an eyebrow at the interruption and mirrored possibly Batman in standing up. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly? I can assure you that I'm telling the truth. I've served the Wayne family for almost 10 years now." Possibly Batman scoffed derisively. "Bruce Wayne, as it happens, the only living member of the Wayne family." Pennyworth stopped short, his eyes widening. "Excuse me?" Bruce Wayne. And holy shit, that was why he seemed so familiar. He was Bruce fucking Wayne. Smiled coldly. There were a few specks of blood on his face, which made his expression even more unsettling. What, upset your ruse is up? You should have expected to run into me when kidnapping children and bringing them to Wayne Manor, of all places. Did you research the Waynes at all? Research? I don't have to research them. As I said, I've served them for a long time. You can ask any of the household members. As it happens, I don't remember any Wayne called Bruce. I'm afraid it's quite hypocritical of you to call me a liar, Pennyworth stated at Wayne with hard eyes. But he is Bruce Wayne and he lives here. The kid next to Wayne, the one with blue eyes, suddenly piped up, sounding confused. I live next door and I've seen him come and go from my window. He isn't a liar. Jason didn't say anything, but he was with the boy here. This was Bruce Wayne, and he was the last member of the prestigious Wayne family, richest man on the East Coast and known playboy. Even he knew that, and he grew up in Crime Alley and was homeless. He'd expected Wayne to look smug now that someone had corroborated his story, but instead, the man turned round to the child, confusion on his face. I don't have any neighbors, he said, brow furrowed. The last ones were the Drakes, and they moved out over a year ago, so. Actually, the Wayne neighbors are the Crowns. What? No, we still live here. My parents were just at your gala a few months ago. Isn't the Wayne called Patrick? The teenager asked, sounding confused. All wrong. Small child had apparently decided to join the conversation as well. My father is called Solomon Wayne, son of Charles Wayne. Everyone was talking at the same time, and the voices pounded in Jason's head. He grit his teeth and stood. Shut up! He snapped loudly, and when no one reacted, he replied even louder, Shut the fuck up! Silence. Everyone turned to look at him, varying expressions on their mostly Mud Street faces. Pennyworth especially seemed taken aback by Jason's choice of words. Huh. Old Posh man wasn't used to swear words, not his fucking problem. Clearly, Jason said, everyone has different opinions here. Still, I'd like to move on and find out what the fuck happened. I know about you, but before I came to this place, I woke up in a graveyard next to something that looked like my own grave, which I apparently crawled out of. And judging by your looks, he gestured to everyone but Wayne, you had similar experiences. Does anyone happen to know anything about that? No one said anything. Wayne stared at him with a shocked expression. What? What do you mean you came out of a grave? Well, Pennyworth piped up, voice forcibly calm again. We all did, it seems, like this boy said. He gestured to Jason. I woke up in Gotham Cemetery next to the grave with my own name, looking like this. He indicated his muddy clothing. And then, all of a sudden, I knew that I had to go to Wayne Manor. It was like someone else was controlling my feet, the tan teenager said, voice slightly trembling now. Yeah, me too. God. I woke up in Robinson Park next to a hole in the ground, and the last thing I remember is bleeding out from getting shot by one of Zuko's men. Did I die? Did someone bury me there? He sounded horrified, his breaths getting faster. I woke on the Drake Estate grounds, the 11-year-old said slowly, ignoring the teenager's words, sounding like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Also next to a hole, and I remember tripping on my blanket while going down the stairs. I think I felt, wait. He was completely still for 1 second, his hand briefly going to his throat, then over his heart. I I don't have a heartbeat, he finally stuttered, pressing down his palm harder like he could force it to appear. I don't have a heartbeat! Panic seeped into his voice. Jason's hand flew to his wrist, pressing down on the pulse point. He frantically waited for the telltale thump thump as his blood was pumped throughout his body. Sure, he'd woken up next to his grave, but he was standing here. He was obviously alive. There was no pulse. Jason didn't have a heartbeat. His chest was horribly still, something he only recognized as wrong now that he was paying attention to it. He didn't have a fucking heartbeat. He'd crawled out of a grave. They all stared at each other with mounting expressions of horror as it became clear that apparently every single one of the people in this room was dead. 3 hours later found Jason curled up in one of the armchairs that stood next to the couches they'd woken up on. He felt very, very tired. His head hurt, and wasn't that unfair? He was dead, but still could get a headache? Honestly, what the fuck? The last hours had consisted of several panic attacks and shouting, and after the aforementioned chaos had somewhat calmed down, trying to gather the facts. Pennyworth had at some point taken charge of the conversation again and had each of them explain what they remembered. It was a fucking mind blowing mess, in Jason's opinion. Looking at the people around him exhaustedly sitting on the couches, they all could agree on that. And they weren't even finished yet. Currently, Damien, the youngest child, whose full name was apparently Damien Al Ghul, was in the middle of telling his story. He sounded overwhelmed and like he was trying very hard not to cry, on a tough front but steadily failing at it. The kid had only been 9 years old when he died, though he looked like 7, slightly emaciated and tiny. According to Damien, he was the illegitimate son of Solomon Wayne, who in turn was the son of Charles Wayne, head of the Wayne family, in fucking 1860. Damien's mother, Talia, originally from the Ottoman Empire, had worked as a servant in the Wayne household and had had an affair with Solomon Wayne, which had resulted in Damien, who was born in 1851. While Solomon wouldn't marry Talia, snobbish, racist prick, he'd at least had the decency to let Damien live in Wayne Manor with his mother. Though both still had to work, of course. Never mind that Damien had been a small child. If you couldn't tell, Jason didn't have a very high opinion of this Solomon Wayne. Several of the servants got sick, Damien explained just now, his voice getting thicker, though he tried to hide it. It was a fever, and it was very bad. Mother called it typh. He stuttered. Typhoid fever? Pennyworth suggested in a soft voice. Yes, Damien stated, nodding at the man but avoiding his gaze. Exactly. Well, he breathed in deeply. I contracted the disease as well, and mother tried to take care of me, but he shouldn't. I don't remember. Everything hurt. I was so tired and thirsty and too hot and cold, and he broke off. Seeing that you all died before this, I seem to have perished due to the fever as well. My mother must have buried me on the grounds of the estate, as that is why I came to. Damien tucked the blanket Wayne had gotten him earlier tied around his shoulders, looking away from them. He was blinking very quickly and pressed himself back into the couch cushions like he wanted to disappear into them. They all silently decided to leave the boy be for the moment. Jason would have liked to say he tried to comfort him, but honestly, he was too preoccupied with coming to terms with his own death and apparent resurrection, and the fact that Damien had apparently been born and died in the 19th century. Sue him. Everyone's gaze went under to Bruce Wayne, who was sitting in the only other armchair. The man had so far been the most silent, only grunting then and now, occasionally asking sharp questions, in some rare display of emotion, getting up and wordlessly handing everyone a blanket from a nearby closet. His brow was set in permanent frown, and Jason wondered if he had a headache too. He certainly looked like it. It seems like it is your turn now, Mr. Wayne, Pennyworth commented. I'm sure we're all eager to hear your side of the story, especially as you don't seem to have come out of your grave as we others did. The older man was right. Jason was very curious to hear what Wayne had to say, seeing as the allegedly airhead playboy was wearing the Batman suit sans cowl and was covered in blood. He was dying to hear it, so to speak. Huh. Not that the other stories had been boring. No, there had been plenty of shocking revelations tonight. Jason didn't even know where to start freaking out about. Pennyworth had apparently really been the Wayne family's butler. It just turned out that had been in the 50s. He'd been in the British intelligence during World War II. It sounds very important and very secret, and had decided to retire after that to lead a more quiet life. Thus, he came to the US, where he eventually started working for the Waynes. The last thing he remembered was being in his bedroom in Wayne Manor and a sudden pain in his chest. Heart attack, most likely, considering the next time he'd woken up was in Gotham Cemetery nearly 70 years later. The teenager's name was Richard Grayson. Call me Dick. Jason had snorted at that one. It hadn't surprised him to hear that Dick had been born in the 1960s, when that nickname had been much more popular and less associated with other meanings. Dick told them that he'd grown up in a circus, traveling throughout the US along with his parents, who were trapeze artists, until they'd come to Gotham, where Dick's parents' ropes had snapped during a performance and they'd fallen to their deaths. Dick, only 8 years old at the time, had been shoved into Gotham's foster system, which was abysmal nowadays, so Jason didn't want to know what it had been like in the 60s for a Romani kid whose first language wasn't even English. Suffice to say, it must have been bad. Dick's story took a surprising turn when he explained how he'd secretly investigated his parents' death over the next few years and finally found out that they'd been murdered by a mobster called Tony Zuko, which, because the circus had refused to pay protection money. He told them how he'd painstakingly tracked Zuko down and tried to confront him, only to be shot multiple times before even getting through the entrance to the criminal's hideout. The last thing he remembered was bleeding out on the ground of some abyss-banded building in South Gotham. Zuko's man must have buried his body in an unmarked grave in Robinson Park after that, considering that was why he'd woken up. He'd been 17 at the time of his death. The other kid, who had claimed to be Bruce Wayne's neighbor earlier, was called Timothy Drake, but insisted on being called Tim. Wayne had shown uncharacteristically much emotion after the boy had told him his name, shocked and looking mildly sick. Apparently, they really had neighbors a few years ago, though Wayne had failed to notice that the Drakes were criminally neglecting their own son by leaving him home alone for months at a time. He turned 9. Not that Tim had worded it that way, but Jason could read between the lines. Tim had died in the same year Jason had, 2022, at the age of 11. Having walked down the stairs in Drake Manor with a blanket round his shoulders, because the heating had broken down earlier. His feet had gotten entangled in the fabric, and he'd stumbled, crashing down the stairs, not being able to remember anything after that. Wayne had then informed them with an unreadable expression that the Drakes had never announced their son had died. In fact, he told everyone who wanted to hear it how Tammy was in some boarding school for gifted kids in Europe. In reality, Tim had been 6 feet under, buried in the Drake estate's garden without even a headstone. Probably by his parents, who must have had discovered his body when they returned from their travels. They had moved out 6 months later, relocating their company to the west coast. It was particularly horrifying story considering it had been Tim's own parents who were indirectly responsible for his death and directly responsible for hiding their son's body in an unmarked grave before fleeing the scene of the crime forever. Jason fell ill. At some point, he told the others his own life story as well. It seemed only fair, though that didn't mean Jason liked recounting his tragic backstory of landing on the streets even one bit. He hated thinking about it. His father kicked the bucket during his third stint in prison. Good riddance. And then his mom had overdosed when he was 11. 2 years later, found him trying to survive alone in Crime Alley, when the stuff with the snow and being kicked out of his hideout happened. He ended his monologue with a quote, and then I froze to death and woke up in the cemetery with a headstone that said John Doe, trying to ignore the pitiful glances he received from the other occupants of the room. Not that they'd much room to talk, considering most of their deaths were every bit as tragic as his own. Well, that was that. Now, Jason was very curious about the obvious outliers' recounting of what had happened. He looked at Wayne expectantly. Wayne didn't seem to like all the attention and twitched in his seat, avoiding their eyes by looking into his lap where his bloody hands were clenched. Eventually he grunted. All right. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. It seems this is extenuating circumstances anyway, and it's not like you haven't seen my suit. Jason leaned closer. Holy shit, Bruce Wayne was really Batman, wasn't he? Wayne grumbled again. It sounded vaguely unhappy. I'm Batman, he said curtly without looking up. Tim made an excited noise, and Jason internally patted himself on the back for guessing right. Before the man could continue, Pennyworth cleared his throat. And would you care to expand that statement for those present that didn't live in the 21st century? He asked, painfully polite as seemed to be his standard setting. Wayne's face twitched, though, as always, Jason found it hard to tell what he felt. The man was harder to read than Shakespeare's Hamlet. Jason was one of the few people who actually liked that play, but it was still difficult to understand when he was 10. Right, well, to start at the beginning, I'm the son of Thomas and Martha Wayne. My father's father was Patrick Wayne, whom two of you should be familiar with. Pennyworth sounding sad. Mr. Wayne's wife, Elizabeth, was with child at the time I died. Was that? My father was born in 1960, so the timeline seems to fit. Wayne replied. You said your death happened in 1959? Pennyworth sighed. So it seemed. Right. To continue, he was interrupted by an exciting sounding Dick Grayson. I knew Patrick and Thomas Wayne as well. I knew all of them, he amended, apparently glad he could finally contribute something to the conversation. Thomas was the same age as me, and he and his father often appeared in the newspaper. He trailed off as everyone's eyes landed on him. That's about all I know of them, I guess. They cleared his throat. Sorry for interruption. Wayne grunted once more, though it didn't sound annoyed. Jason was slowly getting the hang of this. Yeah, I suppose you'd have heard of them. He closed his eyes, like it hurt him to say what came next. Jason knew why. My father and mother were shot by a mugger in an alley when I was 8 years old. That was in 1997. Pennyworth sucked in a shocked breath. Oh dear, that's for Mr. Wayne's child to have died so young, and his wife as well. I'm really sorry, my boy. He'd said similar things to all of them when they told their stories, but seemed even more affected now. Probably because he had personal connection to the victims. Also, it was hilarious that Pennyworth suddenly called Wayne my boy, came with the territory of finding out the man in front of him was your late employer's grandchild. It isn't supposed. Who took care of you after that? Wayne was still looking at his hands, knuckles white. My uncle, Jason Kane, my mother's brother, he said, though I didn't see him very much. Seeing as he was busy running cane industries, I was raised here in Wayne Manor by multiple caretakers he hired, though they often changed. When I was 16, I ran away. I wanted to make a change in the world, to fight crime and prevent tragedies such as my own parents' deaths from ever happening again. So I left Gotham and started traveling the world to learn the skills necessary to do that. Jason gaped. That's why you ran away? Everyone says you eloped with some girl and lived a wild life in Vegas until you returned. Wayne actually looked up and gave him a deadpan look. Yeah, that's what they assumed while I was gone, especially because I'd taken a good chunk of cash with me. I fed into those beliefs when I came back to further discourage anyone from making the connection to me being Batman. That made sense. Jason had to give it to Wayne. The man certainly had fooled everyone very thoroughly. It was clear by now that he wasn't an airheaded playboy at all. Really. He was a fucking genius actor if this was what his real personality looked like. Wayne looked back down. I trained with various teachers all over the world. Martial artists, crime solving, handling different weapons, technology, and other things. When I thought I had sufficient knowledge and skills 12 years later, I returned to Gotham. There I took on the mantle of Batman, fighting crime anonymously at night, trying to make Gotham a safer place. That's so cool! Tim said loudly in an awed tone, then shrank in on himself when the rest of the room turned to him. Um, Never mind. He cleared his throat, obviously trying to sound professional and less excited, though he failed. Please continue. And Jason could barely believe it, but for a moment he thought he saw Wayne's lips twitch into an amused smile. Well, that was more likely that he'd started hallucinating, or that Bruce Wayne showcased actual positive emotions, trademarks. He wasn't sure. Excuse me, but what? But do you mind me asking why they called you the Batman? Pennyworth asked, lifting one eyebrow and looking like the picture perfect example of polite curiosity, if you ignored the mud that was still on his face. Jason couldn't resist. That would be because he dresses up like a giant bat to fight crime, with bat ears on his cowl and a cape and a symbol and everything. He piped up, trying to look innocent, but internally laughing at the way Wayne cringed at his explanation. Wayne grunted. Yes, he admitted, looking at Pennyworth and sighing when he saw the older man's incredulous expression. It's a long story. And then one of Black Mask's goons got a lucky shot that hit my thigh, Wayne said, unhappy frown deepening. It was almost at the end of his lengthy explanation in the timeline was go anything to go by. Apparently, it was currently November 2024, and he was recounting what had happened 2 days before. And fuck, Jason had almost lost 3 years. Though he supposed he couldn't complain with Damien, Pennyworth, and Dick in the room. It still felt wrong, though, and left him reeling. Wayne absent-mindedly laid a palm over his right thigh, presumably where he'd been shot. Now that Jason knew, he could see the way the black fabric of his suit was colored darker there, probably due to blood. The stain seemed concerningly large. I managed to call the Batmobile and escaped the situation, and I tried to take care of the wound, but once I was back in the Batcave, I'd lost a lot of blood. Wayne continued in a somber voice. I went to the med bay. Didn't he mean the Bat med bay? Jason thought sarcastically, but managed to keep his thoughts to himself, and tried to stop the bleeding. It was hard. I suspected that a major artery was hit. Apparently, I lost consciousness at some point. I must have bled out, considering my heart doesn't beat either anymore. There's no way for me to have survived the wound without help at that point. Wayne sounded uncharacteristically shaken during the last part, which was fair. He'd died. At least this explained the blood on his hands and face. Jason was glad the man hadn't murdered someone. In fact, as far as he knew, Batman made it a point to never kill. He'd overheard several gang members talking about it once. It made him relax slightly. Not that anything bad could have happened. Jason was already dead, but still. So that's it, Dick concluded, frowning as well. You died too, and then we all just decided we had enough of being dead and got up the next night. Wayne's lips turned downwards even more. I don't know. I've encountered a few mystical things during my travels, some of which could even be described as magic, but to my knowledge, the only way to bring back the dead is by exposure to a so called Lazarus pit. And that's clearly not what happened here, as we all woke up in different locations. Also, using a Lazarus pit comes at a cost, and no one here seems to be displaying the side effects. Which would be? Pennyworth asked, like it was totally normal to discuss ways to raise the dead. Just a typical tea time conversation, really. What was Jason's life, or unlife? Undead life? Death? Mostly uncontrollable anger, and during that, green glowing eyes. Problems to think rationally. I think it's safe to say that at this point that doesn't apply to anyone here. Wayne said, and Jason had to agree. They'd sat here for several hours now, and no one was displaying any green glowing eyes or seemed angered beyond reason. Mostly, they were all in various states of exhaustion, disbelief, and resignation at being dead. Jason looked around the room, apparently a living room in Wayne Manor, one of the few rooms Wayne was actually actively using. It explained that he lived alone, not trusting anyone being in the house unsupervised, with him being Batman and his secret at stake. The man definitely was very paranoid. What, in Wayne Manor, he said, and we all woke up, and then for some reason came here shortly after your death. It seems to be connected. Before he died, none of us came back, even though some of us had been buried for decades. And why us? Tim added, voice thoughtful. He looked more 9 than 11, huddled in his blanket as he was. And Jason's heart briefly ached at the fact that he and Damien had to cope with all of this at their age. Had died so young. At least he had barely grown up to be a teenager before kicking the bucket. Why no one else? At first, I thought maybe it was because of a connection to the Wayne family, but even if you count me into that as the neighbor, which is a far stretch, it wouldn't explain Jason's or Dick's presence. So why us? Tim had barely finished speaking when suddenly something swept over Jason's mind in a similar way that at the cemetery. Only this time, instead of getting up and walking somewhere, his head was suddenly filled with images and impression, emotions they bet weren't Jason's. They felt old and powerful and different in a way that had him instinctively knowing they didn't come from anything human. Jason couldn't move as he watched what the entirety apparently wanted him to see. A feeling of pride washed over him as Batman grappled through a nightly Gotham at a fast pace, occasionally stopping to prevent muggings or a drug deal. Satisfaction filled him as the vigilante saved countless lives, fought mob bosses and rogues successfully. Hope sang in him when he watched him saving victims, returning home to their families, shaken but still alive. It was like he was seeing all of it from every angle all at once, no certain vantage point discernible. Like Jason was the city, every building, every street and corner. It was indescribable. But then the scene changed, and the positive feelings were replaced with deepening concern. Jason looked at Batman as he fought what appeared to be the Black Mask and his men while trying to stop a weapon shipment. As he got shot in the thigh, just briefly crumbling but standing up again, slowly retreating with clenched teeth. Finally, the Batmobile arrived and he managed to get in, the car driving away at record speed. Bullets ricocheted off its rear, and the shouts of Black Mask's goons rang in Jason's ears, and it brought Batman to safety. The scene changed again. Now Jason was in what he could only assume was the Batcave, though I didn't have time to look at it too closely, as the entity was focusing on a hurt Batman that stumbled out of the Batmobile. He'd taken off his gloves, his hands red as he desperately pressed down onto the gun wound. A tourniquet was in place above it as well, but blood was seeped through his fingers at a concerning rate. Somehow he made it into what looked like the map bay and collapsed onto the gurney, pained grunts escaping him the whole way. Batman took off his cowl with a shaking hand and tossed it aside, Bruce Wayne looking down at his thigh with a determined expression, reaching for something on the table next to him while pressing down on the wound with his other hand. Wayne's trembling got worse, though, and just as his finger closed around something, he swayed. The thing clattered to the ground as his hold lightened. Jason watched Batman lose consciousness, slumping on his side, limp. His hand fell away from the wound, bright red blood continuing to gush out. And then, a few minutes later, Wayne's labored breaths stopped after one last exhale, his chest no longer moving. He was dead. Horror filled Jason, and a deep feeling of loss. This wasn't right. His bat was supposed to help him to fight the rot that seemed to grow in every corner, to save his people and to make them feel safer again, to make him feel more hopeful and lighter than in decades. Grief and disbelief permeated through him, for an unknown amount of time while looking at Bruce Wayne's unmoving body lying in its own blood. Then suddenly the feelings changed once more. Determination and refusal to let this be the end of the bat rose up in him. He knew just that uh, would never be anyone else capable of what Wayne did. No one would be willing to go to such lengths to fight crime in Gotham, who also had the means and skill to make his vision reality. This wouldn't be the end. Gotham, and he was Gotham. Jason Lee suddenly knew with absolute certainty, wouldn't allow this. She wouldn't. No, she thought of a plan. She'd revive her bat, keep him alive with her own energy, which would also solve the problem of him being so frightfully vulnerable and mortal. But that wouldn't be enough. She knew that her bat had died tonight because he'd been alone, had also had no one to help him. And even before today, his health had been steadily declining, physically and mentally. He'd become worn down, lonely, and broken by what had to see every night, but couldn't talk to anyone about. No, if Gotham revived him, she'd make sure he had all the things humans needed to thrive this time. She didn't have much experience with humans' needs throughout her life. They've cataloged the most important ones. Her bat needed to be able to socialize without having to hide his secret, needed support and positive feelings to outweigh the bad things he faced daily. He needed proper sustenance instead of the things heated up in the microwave and orders to be brought to him. He needed someone who could treat his injuries when he couldn't do it himself. Gotham thought about it for a while and came to the conclusion. Most humans had those things because they were part of a so-called family. From what she knew, family members took care of each other, provided each other with protection and meals and company and love. If she gave her bad family members that was suited to his needs, she'd solve most of the issue he had before dying. So she'd give her bed a family. She had no power over the living, only those who'd died within her borders after several years of living there, and only if their remains were still within her reach. So she'd work with that. She briefly thought about just bringing back her bat's original caretakers, who died when he was young, but they'd only ever known him as someone helpless and in need of protection. That was the risk. They discouraged her bat from his endeavor of helping Gotham because of that, and that would go against the purpose of reviving him in the first place. So, not them. Quickly, Gotham went over her other options and eventually found a good candidate, an old caretaker of the Wayne family who was not only capable to prepare nutritional meals and had medical knowledge, he could also fight if necessary and had experience with working in difficult situations. Perfect. Who else? Most human families also had children, young humans, not yet fully grown. They seemed to bring joy to the caretakers, and Gotham wanted her bat to be happy. So it was sensible to include those as well. In many cases, the children were related to their caretakers by blood, but it wasn't a set requirement. Nevertheless, Gotham chose a young boy who had Wayne blood in him and added him to her mental lists. She was unsure, however, if that would be enough. The boy was very young, not even 10 years old, and wouldn't ever grow up like normal humans did. Human families, however, had children whose age changed over time. Which age would be the correct one to make her bat the happiest? Gotham couldn't decide. Well, no matter. She could just add more children of varying ages to be on the safe side. Idly, she looked through her options again. She found no more fitting children with Wayne blood, but that wasn't mandatory anyways. Eventually, she settled on three more children who possessed physical similarities to her bat, and, just as the first boy, seemed like a good fit personality wise. Smart, determined, curious, loyal. The qualities she valued in her bat. One last issue remained, though. Gotham knew from her research that even families could fall apart and cause more sadness and anger than joy and love. She couldn't let that happen here. Luckily, due to the bat and his family being alive through her power, it would be possible for her to influence their minds to a certain extent. She'd simply erect some boundaries there so they'd be unable to betray or leave each other. Problem solved. Gotham no longer felt sad. Instead, she thrummed with excitement, eager to begin her work. This would be perfect. Her bat would come back stronger and happier and with more support than ever. And she'd continued to have a protector against the rot of crime and cruelty that had threatened to overwhelm her before her bat came along. Happily, she got to work. Jason gasped as he was suddenly back in his own body, the image of a motionless, bloody Bruce Wayne vanishing from his sight. His fingers buried themselves in the soft cushions of the armchair while he panted, reeling from what he'd just experienced. A vague echo of Gotham's satisfaction and eagerness still reverberating in his head. What the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck? What the fuck? Jason's voice finally voiced his thoughts. Voice faint and disbelieving, trying to get his breathing under control. What the fuck? I second that, Dick stated, sounding as rattled as Jason felt. It seemed he hadn't been the only spectre to whatever he'd just seen. If he had to guess, Gotham had shown it to them all. Because apparently a supernatural entity that was the personification of the fucking city of Gotham had gotten attached to a certain vigilante and didn't want to lose him. And Jason was a component of what she deemed necessary to keep her bat healthy and happy so he could continue to fight crime. This was so ludicrous and absurd that it couldn't be anything other than the truth. Jason wouldn't be able to come up with this shit himself in a million years. It seems we just received the answer to Mr. Tim's question, Pennyworth said, and even he sounded shocked. Jason glanced at him, his breathing only slowly returning to normal. The older man's eyes were wide open, staring at Wayne disbelievingly. Gotham was the one to bring us back on together. I assume we all saw that? Wayne himself seemed to be at a loss for words. His face was a complicated mix of horror, disbelief, and incredulity and realization. He remained silent, his jaw set and looking at the ground. Tim nodded, while he sat on the couch, the only one out of them who somehow didn't seem to put out about the entity's machinations. If anything, he sounded relieved when he spoke, like he'd just received good news. Yes, I can't believe it. Gotham is real. Of course you wouldn't want to lose a protector. It only makes sense. Sense? Jason didn't mean to interrupt the kid, but something in him balked afterwards. This doesn't make fucking sense, he repeated, angry, getting up to his feet, his hands formed into fists at his sides. Gotham has no idea how humans really work and decided on a fucking whim to throw us all together because she didn't want to lose her toy. We were all just conveniently there to fit into her scheme, so she revived us. Well, took a deep breath. I, for one, have no fucking intention of being part of Batman's emotional support family because the man didn't manage to take care of himself properly. He glared at Wayne, who winced slightly but still didn't say anything. Mr. Jason, Pennyworth started, but Jason didn't let him finish. No, I don't care. I have a life. Okay? He didn't. He died, but that was besides the point here. And I refuse. If you want to play Happy Family with Wayne and Gotham, be my guest, but I'm out. Jason took a step into the direction of the door and froze as an overwhelming sense of dread suddenly swamped his thoughts. His breathing hitched. What was he thinking? He couldn't leave his family. They were all he had. Something terrible would happen if he did this. Something terrible, too horrible to imagine. He couldn't. Jason remained where he was, unable to take another step. He stood there, emotions warring in his head. Horrible fear and shame clashing with common sense. He knew these sudden feelings weren't really his, but induced by Gotham to stop him from leaving. But that didn't make them go away. It didn't make them feel any less real. Jason couldn't breathe. Even thinking about it felt wrong. He just couldn't. The second Jason decided that he wouldn't leave, the artificial feelings vanished like they'd never been there. His knees wobbled and he collapsed, exhausted and horrified beyond belief at the implications of what just happened. Jason! Wayne's deep voice sounded out over the ringing in his head. Before he could collide with the floor, strong arms were suddenly around him, steadying him and helping him back to the armchair. Jason obeyed numbly, sinking back into its soft cushions, cradling the blanket he'd left there when he stood up with unfeeling fingers. Wayne let go of him but continued to hold nearby. What happened? Are you all right? Jason couldn't help it. He let out a bitter laugh at that question. Sure, I'm perfectly fine, just peachy. I died. Got revived by some fucking eldritch entity, forced into a random group of people I can't even think about leaving without getting a panic attack. He took a second to gasp for breath, then gestured at the six of them. We're all fucking prisoners. Gotham won't let us leave or go against her plan. She's fucking with our heads. We're stuck here. Deep breaths, Mr. Jason, Pennyworth said, coming closer and carefully placing his hands on Jason's shoulder. You need to calm down. This is much to take in, and I believe no one here is happy about it, but losing our heads now won't help. Deep breaths. You're safe for the moment. We'll sort this out. But I can't just breathe. Everything will be fine. Jason very much doubted that. Alright. Yeah. That's a lot. End of chapter 1. Yeah. Did a lot of wheezing and vocal things I don't often do. A part of the author's notes. On another note, as you may have noticed, Jason calls Tim and Damien kids, but doesn't count himself in that same category. He is still very much a kid. He's just 13, but he just doesn't see himself that way, as he was forced to grow up really fast. Poor Jason. The author used a Reddit post as reference for the family tree. If you want to see that, the link is in the original fic, end of chapter 1. Um, if you heard my cat, that's my cat. I'm going to free her from my room in a minute. See you next week. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any recommendations for what I should do next, leave them in the comments or just say anything. Thank you for listening. I just realised the font I used on the thumbnail is called Poor Richard. I find this kind of ironic. But anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe if you want to be certain you see the next video. And that's all.